Rudo falling, dirt and plastic tear past his face. A mouth of rust and rubber gapes below. Splashes. A clawed silhouette tearing a trash heap open. A child's scream swallowed by wind. Rudo spitting blood and swearing in the dark. He is not just shoved away. He is unmade, an orphan accused, cast into a hellscape of trash-mutated monsters. That's Gachiakuta. But Rudo's exile isn't only punishment, it's metamorphosis. In the pit, he confronts not just beasts, but the poisoned roots of the world above. This is how exile breaks and remakes identity. That line is a promise. What follows isn't a simple survival story. It's an anatomy of exile. The pit will do two things to Rudo: strip away the masks the world forced on him and force him to forge new ones. It will show him what society refuses to look at and what he might become when he learns to look back. The pit is not scenery. It is a psychological landscape, a dumped conscience made substance. Imagine a city's worst things rendered literal. The waste the affluent refuse to see, the cast-offs labeled criminal or contaminant, the offcuts of policy and prejudice. All of it sloshes together into one geography: toxic, rancid, and raw. In Gachiakuta, the pit is where societies refuse cultures, not only its garbage, but its guilt. It is the place the above-ground world consigns to oblivion, and where that oblivion begins to bite back. Read psychologically. The pit functions like a collective unconscious given a body. The things a community represses: shame, hypocrisy, denial, the appetites it pretends not to have, condense into monsters. They are not supernatural curiosities for spectacle, thy projections. What a city refuses to acknowledge about itself becomes a predator wading through its own rot. The trash beasts are not merely enemies for Rudo to slaughter. They are the image of what the world casts out: disorder, consequence. It's the shadow that grows when you refuse to integrate what you have disavowed. Jean-Paul Sartre said it bluntly: hell is other people. In the pit, that line gets an extra layer. Hell is other people's refuse. The social relationships that define us above ground degrade into accusation. People don't merely judge Rudo. They discard him. For the rest of society erects fences and polite moralities. The pit collects the discarded moral residue: the crimes unpunished, the sorrows unsympathetic, the faces no one will look at. Exile is the ultimate social sentence, not merely to be alone, but to become what others pretend you already are. Exile works by stripping away belonging. Identity is partly given to us by our place in the social world: names, roles, reputations. When a person is cast out, those scaffolds collapse. For Rudo, the accusation doesn't only take a legal status, it takes the scaffolding of being. He loses access to the mirror that reflects him as an ordinary member of a community. In the pit, mirrors are broken, and where mirrors once offered validation, there are only echoes, versions of himself he does not recognize. But there's a sharper point to make. The pit does not only remove masks, it threatens to replace the self with the thing the world believes you are. Being cast into filth doesn't just humble, it can teach you to internalize filth. When every interaction treats you as disposable, your inner narrative can adapt. It learns to anticipate contempt. Shame calcifies into defensive rage. The environment of rejection presses you into a narrower shape until survival becomes indistinguishable from becoming the thing you were labeled. Understanding the pit as psychological terrain shifts how we read Rudo's struggle. He is not simply fighting monsters for a throne of vengeance. He is wrestling with the social story that made him expendable. He must decide whether exile will be an erasure or a forge. Will the pit's reflections convince him he is garbage, to be assimilated into its appetite? Or will those reflections be the raw material of a new identity, one he chooses rather than inherits? To answer that, we first need to rewind and see who Rudo was before the fall, what he carried into the pit, and what the accusation actually took away. Before the pit, Rudo was already a divided story. He was an orphan, not only without parents, but without the ordinary scaffolding of a life. Name, place, relations. Orphans in fiction are free. In this world, they are footnotes, convenient blanks to be filled by whoever holds the pen. Rudo's particular blank became a wound when a crime he didn't commit was stamped onto his chest. The accusation was public and precise. Guilty. The verdict of the street arrived before any court. Social identity theory gives us language for what that does. We are not only what we feel inside, okay? We are what our group says we are. Labels are social currencies. When a community marks you as criminal, the world rearranges. Doors close, eyes avert, conversations harden into warnings. Over time, the label moves from an external tag to an internal voice. The mirror you once used to check your face is replaced by a cracked reflection that only ever shows the accusation. Identity, which should be self-authored, becomes administered. Rudo reacts the way someone taught to expect contempt reacts. Anger and defiance. That rage is a shield. It's loud, visible, and it keeps pity or soft interrogation at bay. It's better to be feared than to be pitied. But the shield also reveals the truth. He has learned exile, piece by piece. The defiant posture is proof he is already half cast out. Why every handshake can be a shove, when every courtesy can be a test. You learn to stand in confrontation rather than trust. The world becomes a set of barbs, and you wrap yourself in barbs in return. There is a cruelty to wrongful accusation that goes beyond the legal. To be accused is to have a story imposed on you. Your narrative agency is wrested from your hands and handed to rumor and accusation. For Rudo, the accusation didn't just cost him freedom. It cost him the chance to be seen as ordinary, as redeemable, as someone with a future. Instead, his identity calcified around disgrace. People didn't ask who he might become. They assumed they already knew who he was. In that sense, exile was not a new thing. It was the culmination, the public performance, of years of being treated as disposable. That accumulation matters. Exile is better understood as a process than a moment. The pit is the final scene on a long record of small exclusions. A teacher's aside, a landlord's terse letter, a neighbor's tightened smile. Each little rejection is a place marked on a map. When the state, or the mob, or some cruel accident takes the final step of ejecting him, it is not that he moves suddenly into exile. Exile arrives like a tide that finally covers all the ground he once stood on. The pit is simply where that tide is collected and concentrated. So Rudo enters the pit not as a whole person shattered by one event, but as a self that has already been eroded. His rage and cunning are scars and tools. He brings to the pit a shape already pressed by exclusion, uprising. The accusation didn't make him unwanted. It formalized what had been lived for a long time. The difference now is environment. Where above-ground rejection was episodic, the pit makes it permanent. Where once he could find a shopkeeper's nod or a child's smile, now the only faces are instincts and hunger. And then society literally throws him away into the pit, where rejection becomes architecture. The pit is a world that has learned to smell like its own disgust. It is not simply dirty, it is organized around decay. Piles of consumer refuse become mountain ranges. Water runs black. The air is thick with a residue of what the above-ground world no longer wants to touch. Here, abandonment is not metaphor, it is geological. The landscape itself grades human value by odor and rot. To live here is to be defined by what covers you. The monsters that roam this geography are engineered by that same logic. They are not supernatural whims. They are the grotesque embodiments of accumulated negligence, plastics fused with flesh, machinery married to bone. The mutated beasts are the pit's vocabulary for the things the city refused to integrate: waste, neglect, the moral compromises of convenience. Psychologically, they operate as projections. A community represses certain anxieties and appetites, and in the pit, those repressed contents become visible and aggressive. Where civilization refuses to look, the shadow gorges itself into form. Carl Jung's idea of the shadow helps clarify the terror. The shadow is not just bad parts of an individual. It is the unacknowledged material that a psyche refuses to admit. Multiply that by a metropolis, and the shadow becomes a social body. The pit is society's shadow, literally let loose. Each trash beast is a lesson. Here is what we deny. Here is the hunger we pretend not to feed. To call these creatures monsters is to soften their meaning. They are warnings. Fail to honor the seams of your world, and the seams will become teeth. For Rudo, the stakes are intimate. Fighting the pit is not only a matter of strength or skill. It is an existential negotiation with a narrative that has been trying to possess him. Each encounter with the beast reads like an argument with a mirror that spits back a truth you never wanted to hear. You are expendable. You are fecund for the system to consume. You belong to the dust. The external battle against claws and maw folds quickly into an internal skirmish. Will you accept this mirror's verdict, or will you refuse to be read that way? The pressure of this environment compacts identity, and every sound could be the last. The mind narrows into modes that favor survival. Hypervigilance, instrumental thinking, the shrinking of moral imagination into pragmatic ends. Ego structures that rely on community, reputation, or reciprocal care atrophy under those conditions. Or once Rudo might have imagined a future as a craftsman, a neighbor, a citizen, the pit trains him to be immediate. Eat, hide, lash out, live to see the dusk. Long-term projects dissolve. Possibility becomes the luxury of the above ground. Worse, the pit is designed to erase. It does not merely threaten to kill the body. It intends to metabolize identity into its compost. The opportune death here is assimilation. Become so much of the pit's matter that you no longer register as another. People fade into the diet of the landscape. The beasts ingest not only flesh, but the stories that distinguish a life. This is the pit's most monstrous offer. Not an extinguishing of existence, but a reduction of being to undifferentiated matter. That existential violence ripples. When you are forced to live in a place that treats you as garbage, the temptation is to accept the category. Shame becomes adaptive. The psychology of learned disposability takes root. Rudo must constantly correct for that inward pressure, to keep memory of himself as someone more than waste. To preserve the sense that he has a name beyond the accusation pinned to his chest. Every day in the pit is a test of whether the self will be resilient or will capitulate. And yet, the pit is paradoxical. In the same collapse that threatens to erase individuality, the conditions for a new form of belonging emerge. When the above-ground world withdraws recognition, subcultures form. Those who remain learn to exchange other currencies, mutual aid, shared tactics, the language of survival. The dehumanizing pressure does not only crush, it also catalyzes new solidarities, born of necessity. But that is the next beat. For now, the pit doesn't simply want to kill Rudo. It wants to make him part of its waste. It hopes, in the quiet of its rot, that even his memory will be consumed. The cleaners are not a beacon. They are a stubborn flame. They live amid ruin, not pretending it's anything else. Ragged uniforms stitched from discarded tarp. Tools that double as scavenged art. A code that reads like a joke to the above-ground world. We clean the dirt they throw away. Their hands are calloused from making weapons out of rust. From sewing patches of dignity onto bodies the city would rather ignore. They are, crucially, a community formed out of mutual exile. It's the point. Exile met its match, not in a savior, but in others who shared the stain. Where the city refuses recognition, the cleaners offer something different, a mirror that reflects competence, loyalty, and skill. For Rudo, that mirror is medicine. It reflects him not as accused or expendable, but as useful, necessary, and visible. The psychological shift here is direct and brutal. When your standing in the world is rebuilt by people who need you, your sense of self reconfigures around action and belonging. Social identity theory explains the mechanics. Identity isn't only an internal script, it's negotiated in groups. Its belonging to the cleaners offers Rudo a new social category to internalize. Instead of the community tag, guilty, he acquires a new label, cleaner. And with that label comes new norms, language, rituals, expectations. He learns not to see his scars as stains, but as trademarks, proof of survival, evidence of skill. In this new in-group, the prior shame loses a monopoly on meaning. Yet the cleaners don't pretend the pit is a spa. They know they are still dirty. They refuse a morality that says dirt equals moral death. Their ethic is pragmatic and fierce. Survival through mutual aid. Dignity through technique. Rudo's initiation isn't a ceremonial wipe. It's a sequence of tasks that teach him the language of cleanup, how to read a carcass of trash beast for structural weak points, how to turn a rotted gear into a blade, how to patch a friend's wound by night without asking for thanks. Those acts train a muscle no jury could legislate, the muscle of competence under apology. Nietzsche's revaluation of values glows in their practice. Above-ground values favor purity, property, reputation. In the pit, those values are poisoned. Privilege masquerades as virtue. The cleaners invert the scale. Where the city calls garbage worthless, the cleaners call it material. Where the city calls exile shame, the cleaners call it experience. Rudo's brokenness ceases to be a mark of moral failure and becomes a resource. His anger becomes tactical, his cunning becomes craft, his grief becomes a library of survival tricks. In reframing these traits, the group practices a miniature revaluation. What the world embraces as a stigma becomes, here, a competence and an ethic. This is not to romanticize. Cleaners do not erase the things that hurt Rudo. They do not pretend the scars are not painful. What they do is reframe the narrative that made those scars shameful. The world above wrote him as a villain. The cleaners read his story differently, as a sequence of trials that honed skills worth having. Where once his hands were symbols of accusation, now his hands are tools of craft. Where once his silence invited contempt, now his silence calibrates strategy. Longing also remodels time. Above ground, Rudo's future was a hole. No apprenticeship, no steady work, no social investment. Within the cleaners, the horizon returns. He learns patterns that project forward. He can imagine a season in which the group clears a sector of pit, in which a child scavenges safely, in which a name circulates with a kind of quiet respect. That imagined future is a radical therapy. It replaces the anticipatory shame that hollowed him with anticipatory competence that fills him. So yes, the cleaners don't erase his scars. They don't perform miracles. What they do is more dangerous and more honest. They teach him to use those scars. They weaponize his brokenness into technique, his exile into solidarity, his shame into a story that affirms rather than annihilates. The forge of the pit becomes, paradoxically, a place where identity can be rebuilt if you accept the terms of the work. The pit didn't destroy Rudo, it remade him. But what does that say about identity itself? We've tracked a few moves: exile, projection, combat, and community. Each of those moments reframes a philosophical question about what makes a self. Sartre teaches us that existence meets the other in ways that can be hell. Above ground, Rudo was defined by other people's gaze, accused, discarded, erased. That gaze landed as social exile. In the pit, Sartre's insight becomes concrete. Hell isn't metaphysical, it's relational. The city's refusal to recognize him created a condition where being just is being punished. Exile forces a confrontation with the other, the social other. That reflected shame in the literal others who now dwell in the pit. Rudo's task, existentially, is to choose who he will be when all the original mirrors are gone. Social identity theory fills the mechanics. Labels matter. Membership rewrites self-narrative. Rudo's transfer from accused to cleaner is not cosmetic, it's ontological. When the primary categories that structure your life change, so does what you imagine possible for yourself. Belonging can rescue identity from the inertia of stigma by providing new norms, new scripts, and new mirrors. Jung gives us the shadow. The pit is not external only, it is also inner. The trash beasts are society's repressed. Confronting them is a threatened integration. Either you let the shadow own you, or you wrestle it into language and craft. Rudo's path is a form of animated individuation, facing the shadow not with denial, but with hands, with tools, with the grit of action. Nietzsche ties the knot. Where the world above enforced values that fetishize cleanliness and discard, the pit forces a revaluation. Rudo and the cleaners do not ask the city's permission to define meaning. They invent it. Trash becomes tool, exile becomes ethic, survival becomes honor. This is not mere stoic resignation. It is a creative rebirth. Keisha's revaluation is not metaphysical. Keisha, it is tactical and communal. The central thesis emerges clearly. The pit does not define Rudo. It compels him to define himself. In being thrown away, he is given the brutal option to either dissolve into the category the world bestowed, or to become an author of his own code. He chooses the latter, not because pain is noble, but because necessity forces invention. The pit isn't just hell, it's a forge. And what it burns away isn't only weakness, solutions. In exile, Rudo becomes not what society tells him he is, but what he chooses to be. But this rebirth provokes a darker question. If the pit remakes identity, what kind of society throws people into such a furnace? And when the forged man returns to the world that exiled him, what does surviving that trial do to the soul? We'll come back to those questions in the next episode, because Rudo's story is not only about survival. It's a mirror held up to a world that prefers cleanliness to justice. And it asks us whether redemption forged in trash cans stand in a clean world.